Hello everyone. This chapter is going to talk about the biological basis of behavior. And really what we're going to be focusing on are the physical structures in the brain and the body that influence behavior, as well as the chemical structures, things like neurotransmitters, that are present in the brain and other areas of the body that influence behavior. Okay? It's quite a technical chapter. There is a lot of vocabulary and there are a lot of terms. So pay careful attention to those different terms and to those different concepts. We're going to be talking about the different areas of the brain, and we're going to refer to the different areas of the brain in sort of overlapping sections. Sometimes we're going to talk about an area of the brain based on its function. Sometimes we're going to talk about an area of a brain based on its location, and they're going to overlap. The brain is very complicated, and there are a lot of things to consider. So this is just a very, very basic overview of some of the key structures in the brain and the body, some of the key functions and controls of the brain and the body, and to give you a basic understanding of the concepts in biological basis of behavior. Okay, so first, biopsychology. If you break it down, it's biology and psychology, and really what we're looking at is the scientific study of the biological basis of behavioral and mental processes. Okay, and one thing to know is that biological psychology is a field that really is going through a tremendous period of growth right now. And that's for a lot of different reasons. The main reason is actually technology. With newer technologies, we're now able to see functioning of the body in real time, with color images, with three-dimensional images, and it's giving us insight and understanding into things that we could only theorize about before. So the field of biological psychology is growing tremendously. And I suspect that it'll continue to grow tremendously for decades. We're getting a much, much better understanding of the relationship, both direct and indirect, between the physical structures, the chemical components inside the human body, and how they affect behavior. Okay? So, another term is the nervous system. So the nervous system is basically a system of organs and nerves that are in charge of relaying information back and forth from the brain to the body, and from the body to the brain, and within the body and across the body. Okay? All right. So we're going to start from small and go to big. So we're going to start with the neuron, and then we're going to talk about the parts of the neuron and how the parts of the neuron work. And then we're going to elaborate that out to talk about the different the different nervous systems, central and peripheral, and then parts of the brain, etc. Okay? All right. So the neuron is the basic nerve cell. And if you look over here, it's a cartoon picture of a sort of typical neuron. Okay? And there are different parts of the neuron. So we're going to talk about each of the different parts by name, and we'll talk about what their functions are. Okay, so the neuron. Information from a neuron typically travels from here down across and throughout here and comes out over here. Okay, the first part of the neuron that we'll talk about is something called the dendrites. Okay, the dendrites are these sort of, and they're depicted differently in different drawings, but they're sort of these finger-like extensions coming out from the soma, or the cell body of the neuron. What the dendrites do are they're receptors. They take in information through other neurons. Now, one thing to remember is that there are trillions of neurons in the brain and the body. There are just one or two. So all these neurons are next to each other. They're communicating with each other directly or indirectly, and basically, the communication is what we call a chemical communication. There are other types, but for purposes of this course, we're just going to talk about the chemical communication. So imagine this neuron as not being alone. Imagine there being another neuron over here, another neuron here, another neuron here, 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 kind of everywhere around, right? So we're just taking one neuron out. So, and looking at that one neuron sort of abstractly. Okay, so this neuron now is here, and there's one other one here, let's say. Okay, so what happens is with what each part of the neuron does is this neuron over here are dendrites. Okay, and these dendrites receive messages from other neurons. Okay, the soma, or the cell body, is the body of the neuron, and that contains what we call the nucleus, or the brain of the neuron. It tells it what information to respond to. It carries the genetic code for the neuron and the DNA of the neuron. That then brings us to the axon of the neuron, which is a long tube. Okay, and if you see in this picture, it looks like there's sort of this wrapping around the tube. And that wrapping around the tube is something called myelin. It's fatty tissue that does two things. It protects and surrounds the axon of the neuron, and it also speeds up the way that information is transmitted down the axon of the neuron. The axon terminals are here, which terminal means end, so the axon terminals are here. And these axon terminals contain a chemical called a neurotransmitter. Okay? And the axon terminals basically are where the release of the neurotransmitter happens. Okay? After the axon terminals, there is a space called a synapse. And if you look after this space, these are now dendrites of the next neuron. Okay? So the way that the neuron communicates is it receives a message here. The message gets sort of passed down the axon, released here, floats around, and then some of that neurotransmitter attaches to the dendrites of the next neuron. Some of it just floats around and gets broken down by the body. And at the end of the communication, some of whatever's remaining gets reabsorbed in a process called reuptake. So how does this process actually work? Okay, I'll take you through step by step, and I'm going to jump back and forth between this slide and this slide a little bit. Okay, so there are two types of communication, one within the neuron and one between the neurons. The within the neuron is what we call an electrical communication, where a brief electrical impulse sends the information along the axon of the neuron until it hits the terminal button. Okay, so some vocabulary first. Within the axon of the neuron is negatively charged potassium and positively charged sodium, or it's surrounded, I should say, by positively charged sodium, and within it is negatively charged potassium. Those things are called ions. Okay, when the neuron is in its resting state, sort of ready to fire, or waiting to be stimulated, the inside of the neuron is typically filled with negatively charged potassium, and then the outside is surrounded by positively charged sodium. Okay, when the neuron gets ready to fire, what ends up happening is that the sodium floods into the neuron, okay, into the axon of the neuron, changing the charge. And then at a certain point, when the charge changes enough, the terminal buttons then release neurotransmitter. The terminal buttons then fire. Okay? So, what happens? All right, so let's take it step by step. So, the dendrites receive a message from another neuron, and they could receive one of two messages. They'll either receive a message that's excitatory or a message that's inhibitory. An excitatory message tells this neuron to continue to send the message down to the next neuron. An inhibitory message tells this neuron to not send the message. Okay? So, if this gets an excitatory message, right, the dendrites receive the message, okay? The nucleus of the neuron interprets the message, and if it's an excitatory one, it opens up little gates between the myelin here. the gates basically allow positively charged sodium to come in, okay, and changing the charge of the axon. When enough sodium comes in, the neuron from the terminal buttons releases a neurotransmitter, okay? This neurotransmitter then floats around in the synapse. Some of it attaches to the dendrites of the next neuron. If enough of it attaches to the dendrites of the next neuron, it will then activate this neuron, and the same process will happen again, okay? And it'll keep happening again and again and again. And it's just sending a message, okay? That's all that it's doing, okay? So the neurotransmitter is a chemical. Now, this is a blown up picture of the terminal buttons, okay? So, or the axon terminals. So the terminal button at the end of the neuron is here. This is the synapse, this is the space. And now these are the dendrites, or this represents a dendrite of a next neuron. When the neurotransmitter is released in the space, it floats around and some of it attaches to the dendrite of the next neuron, activating that neuron. If it's the proper neuron and if it's the proper neurotransmitter, right, there are a couple of things that have to work together here to make this happen. But without going into detail, in very short form, that's the basic process of sending information back and forth. Okay, now, there are neurons that are receptive to different types of information, and there are different neurotransmitters. The different neurotransmitters are responsible for different functions. Okay, so we're going to go through some of the neurotransmitters, some of the more popular, some of the more important ones, I shouldn't say popular, some of the more important ones in psychology, right? So when we're talking about psychology, we're going to be talking about mood, we're going to be talking about motivation, emotion, so we're going to talk about some of the neurotransmitters that are responsible for the psychological process that we typically study, okay? So first, acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that is responsible for movement, motor control. It helps us to walk, talk, and breathe. It helps us focus and pay attention. And we need acetylcholine to help us form new memories, right? So these neurotransmitters serve multiple functions, okay? And that's important to remember, right? Because some of the medications that we take for psychological disorders or for other conditions affect our neurotransmitters. They affect the availability of neurotransmitters, the production or the release or the reuptake of neurotransmitters. And if these neurotransmitters have multiple functions or multiple influences, imagine what a medication that affects one neurotransmitter can do to the body. It could have multiple effects, not just one. Okay? And this is why finding a medication or developing a medication that could be effective also gets complicated, because there tend to be side effects or unwanted effects, okay? Because of these neurotransmitters, right? These neurotransmitters have a wide effect on the body and on the brain, okay? Serotonin, which is an important one in psychology particularly. So serotonin is involved in the sleep-wake cycle. It's involved in mood. It's very, very common that people who are suffering from symptoms of depression might have lower levels of serotonin in their body. And so a lot of the medications to treat depression target serotonin and actually try to increase the availability of serotonin in the brain. GABA is another one that's very important in psychology. This one helps us relax. It aids in sleep and relaxation. It helps us to feel less anxious. It helps us to calm down. Okay. Norepinephrine is sort of the opposite of GABA. And it basically is an activating neurotransmitter. It's found in a lot of different parts of the brain, and it is involved in the fight or flight response. It's involved in learning and memory. And people that have high levels of norepinephrine may have higher levels of anxiety. They may have higher levels of activation and energy. Dopamine is involved in the pleasure reward system of the brain. It makes you feel good. A lot of addictive drugs trigger the release of dopamine so that people who take the drugs feel good. And of course, if taking the drug makes you feel good, you're going to want more of the drug later on, right? So dopamine dopaminergic neurons can be activated with certain substances of abuse. Endorphins also relate to pleasure and pain. Okay, releasing endorphins can actually make you feel pleasurable or feel good. And certain exercises, if done regularly, can result in the release of endorphins. It can actually reduce pain, and they have a lot of different effects on the body. Oxytocin actually is released in high amounts during the pregnancy process and in other times. And oxytocin actually is called the cuddle hormone or the love hormone. It promotes bonding, empathy, closeness, decreases experiences of stress. So you can understand why in the pregnancy and delivery process the brain might release large amounts of oxytocin, right? Think about how that could functionally affect somebody, especially when there's a new baby and there's a very traumatic and stressful, situation with regard to a delivery, right? Okay, so different parts of the nervous system, okay? So there are two overall major sections of the nervous system, okay? There's what we call the central and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system consists of the nerves that come out from the brain and spinal cord and extend to the other parts of the body. Okay? So, the central nervous system, okay, the brain and the spinal cord. We're not going to talk too much about the spinal cord or the parts of the spinal cord, but just know that the spinal cord is a thin band of neurons that comes down from the bottom of the brain, or from the brainstem, down throughout the neck and the back, and it goes all the way down to the lower back, and even up to the top of the pelvis, okay? And so the brain sends information down the spinal cord, which is this bundle of neurons, and then the spinal cord has connecting nerves that come out from the spinal cord out to the rest of your body, okay? So we're going to talk about sort of the major sections or areas of the brain, and then we're going to break that down and talk a little bit about their functions and what they do, okay? So there are three major regions of the brain, okay? There's the hindbrain, which is down here. There's the midbrain, and then there's the forebrain, okay? The hindbrain is closest to the spinal cord and is responsible for the basic life functions, breathing, swallowing, etc. Okay, the basic things that you need to do just to stay alive. And the hindbrain is actually the part of the brain that forms first in development. Okay, and it makes sense if you think about it, right? Because without that, nothing else really matters, right? If you're not breathing, if your heart rate, if your heart is not beating, nothing else matters. The higher levels of thinking just don't exist, right? The midbrain is between the hind and the forebrain, and for now, at this level, that's all you need to know about it, is where it's located. We're not going to worry about much else. When you get to graduate school, and if you study neuropsychology or biopsychology, then you can study the midbrain a little bit more, okay? The third part of the brain is the forebrain. That part of the brain is the closest to the face, and that's where the major thinking is done. But we're going to go through this in a little bit more depth later on. Okay? So, again, looking at sort of different sections of the brain and breaking them up based on location and functioning. Okay, the medulla, which is down here, the pons, which is here, and the cerebellum, which is back here. Okay, the hindbrain. That's the cerebellum, okay? So the pons area is responsible for arousal, sleeping, and waking. The medulla is responsible for breathing, heart rate, swallowing, and digestion, kind of those basic functions. And the cerebellum is responsible for balance, motor control, coordination, and movement, okay? In the midbrain, there is something called the reticular formation, which is an extension of the pons, and is related to consciousness and wakefulness, okay? The peripheral nervous system, which we mentioned before, basically takes information, right? That's the part of the nervous system that extends out from the spine and goes to the rest of the body. So the peripheral nervous system takes information out from the CNS and delivers information into the CNS, the central nervous system. Okay, the peripheral nervous system is divided into two different parts. Okay, the somatic and autonomic part. Okay, the somatic part of the central nervous system controls voluntary muscles, right? And sensory information, right? Voluntary are the things that you decide to do when you decide to move your hands or walk or nod your head, right? That's all voluntary muscles. The autonomic nervous system, think autonomic, automatic, controls involuntary bodily functions. Okay, involuntary bodily functions are the things that happen without our thinking, right? So digestion, heart rate, pulse, things like that. All that stuff happens automatically. We don't have to tell our hearts, actively at least, we don't have to tell our hearts to beat. It just happens automatically. Or our digestion, excuse me. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system can be separated into two separate parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Okay, and I have two different images here. Okay, the sympathetic nervous system, actually, let me go back for a second. The parasympathetic nervous system is what's active when your body is in its natural resting, steady state. Okay, the parasympathetic nervous system maintains calm. It conserves energy, and it controls your functioning in sort of your day-to-day baseline, right? Gives power to digestion, right? Allows you to move freely, things like that, okay? The sympathetic nervous system becomes active when your body senses a threat. And what the sympathetic nervous system does is it channels the energy into the areas of the body that help you protect yourself. We call it sort of that fight or flight response. Okay? So the things that happen when your sympathetic nervous system becomes active, right? Your pupils will dilate. It will reduce energy and power for digestion. And so saliva is a component of digestion, so it would reduce the salivary response. It will inhibit digestion in the stomach. It might actually affect the digestive process where it contracts the rectum. So some people, when they get anxious or nervous, might feel like you have to go to the bathroom. It will increase bronchial dilation, the volume of air that can be taken in the lungs, and it might relax the bladder. Right, all these things are designed to channel energy into ways that would allow you to run faster, jump higher, focus your energies on ways to protect yourself, either by fending an enemy off or by escaping a dangerous situation. Okay, the parasympathetic does basically the opposite of the sympathetic. So when the parasympathetic system is activated in your steady state, your baseline, the pupil constricts, it gets a little bit smaller. The pupil's dilated to let more light in so you can see better. During the fight or flight stage, right? Your salivary rate would be at baseline, would be normal. Bronchial dilation would be normal, etc. Right? This is your steady state. Okay, this is where you're normally functioning. Okay, here's another image of similar, right? Same process, right? So on the outside of the body, right? Your palms might sweat when the sympathetic nervous system is aroused. Your heart would beat more quickly. The stomach or digestion is inhibited, etc. Versus when you're at your steady state, right? Normal salivary response, normal heart rate, palms are dry, etc. Okay? All right. So, the brain itself, okay, going back to this a little bit. The brain itself weighs about 3 pounds. And it's a highly integrated system where different parts of the brain connect to each other, communicate with each other, interact with each other, and different structures are sort of communicating with each other to affect a result. It could affect thoughts, memories, emotions, mood, movement, etc. Okay, and this is just a different way of breaking down the sections of the brain. Okay, the frontal lobe, which is here, parietal, occipital, temporal, and then the cerebellum and the brainstem. Okay, the frontal lobe is the most advanced level or the most advanced area of the brain. This is the part of the brain that develops last. Okay, the frontal lobe is responsible for inhibition, planning, impulse control, etc. It's responsible for understanding social cues. It tells you it's appropriate or not appropriate to do this, thinking, anticipation, planning, looking at things ahead. Okay, the parietal lobe is involved in sensory information. It assists with the interpretation of touch. When you touch something and you kind of make out what that object is, temperature, texture, size. The parietal lobe is involved with that. The occipital lobe here is for visual processing. We said before the cerebellum is involved in balance, and the temporal lobe assists in perception of sound. The auditory cortex is in here. It also relates to memory. Okay, the brainstem is sort of a relay station which transfers information from the body to the brain and from the brain down to the body. It also controls heart rate and breathing, etc. Okay, we talked about kind of this before, right? The brainstem, which you mentioned earlier, midbrain is responsible for emotions and memory. The cerebral cortex, another area for sort of this outer area of the brain, right? The whole of the functioning is where most of your thinking, feeling, and sensation occurs. And then the prefrontal cortex, that front part of the brain, is where you sort of anticipate, plan events, and demonstrate impulse control, right? This is the part of the brain that they say kind of differentiates us from animals, right? So, a monkey or chimpanzee gets angry and they fight whoever's next to them, right? Because they're angry, they fight. A human might evaluate what are the consequences of attacking somebody. What does that mean? Not to say that humans never fight, right? And they never fight inappropriately. They do, right? But humans theoretically have this ability to say, well, if I fight this person, what does that mean? What does that mean for my job? Will I end up getting in trouble? What does that mean for my career? How will my family look at me? What are the effects of my relationships with other people, right? All of the different anticipatory things that humans are capable of processing that other animals might not be, right? Dog just reacts, right? Something's threatening, they just react. A human might go through a very complex decision process, where other animals might not. And we say that this comes from, or we believe that this comes from the prefrontal cortex, that frontal area of the brain. And we know this because people who have had damage to the prefrontal cortex have lost this ability. It's also affected their personality. A lot of psychology courses, especially intro courses, talk about somebody named Phineas Gage, which was one of the most interesting cases when it comes to brain damage and brain trauma. So I would definitely take a look. In short, Phineas Gage was a gentleman. He was working on the railroad, and he suffered a traumatic brain injury where he lost a piece of his brain, a significant piece of his brain. He survived the injury, and he was still, he still had his memories, he still knew who he was, he still had his identity, but his personality shifted in a lot of ways. He was a nice guy, he was a friendly guy, everybody really loved him, and after the injury, he would just do things differently. He became sort of hostile, he became somewhat obnoxious, people just didn't like to be around him anymore. And it wasn't that he was upset that he got injured. It was just different changes that happened in him. And you can definitely look up, there are a bunch of videos on him and things like that, but it's one of the more fascinating cases in all of psychology when it comes to the influences of brain on behavior. Okay? All right. Just a couple more things to go over. I know this material is dense and there's a lot of it, so just a couple more slides and then we'll be done. Okay, the cerebral cortex, which I mentioned before, is sort of the outer area of the brain, right? Whenever you see a picture of a brain, that's really what you're looking at, okay? The left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, okay? And the cerebral cortex is broken up into two somewhat symmetrical halves. They're not exactly symmetrical. They're slightly different, but somewhat symmetrical halves. And they're connected by this fibrous tissue here called the corpus callosum. Okay? The corpus callosum is a thick band of axons that connect the two hemispheres and allows communication from one half to the other. So information that comes into one side then translates to the other and then goes back again. So if you touch something, and this is going to be confusing, if you touch something with your left hand, the information goes to the right brain. The right brain then needs to send that to the left brain so that the whole brain is kind of on the same page, integrating information. And then that information needs to be sent back again to the right brain and then out to the hand to give the hand feedback. Okay? And all this happens extremely quickly. All right? Certain things are allocated to one side of the brain only, and certain things are kind of mirrored and appear on both sides of the brain. Okay? So speech is only on one side of the brain. Language production, language acquisition, right? Producing words, understanding language, right? Is usually on the left side. Okay? But then there are some things that are on both sides. The visual cortex, right? You have a visual cortex on each side. Although the visual cortex on the right side is responsible for the left-sided vision, and the visual cortex on the left side is responsible for right-sided vision. But if one side is damaged, it is possible that the other side might make up for it if you have those functions on both sides. The problem is that if you have functioning of an area only on one side of the brain, and that side is damaged badly enough, if that functioning, such as speech or language, doesn't exist on the other side has a very difficult time, if not impossible time, compensating. Okay? So for the things that we do in our everyday world, in a Western world, in a society where we rely on math and language and communication, the left side of the brain is much, much more important to us for our day-to-day functioning. So, there's not a joke, but it's almost a joke where, neuropsychologists, neuroscientists say, don't leave the house without your left brain, right? Because that's the side of the brain that really governs our day-to-day interactions. The right side of the brain, which is responsible for spatial skills, visual processing, things like that, is still extremely important, but not in the same way in the current society that the left brain is, right? Now, if you were a hunter-gatherer years ago and you had to process visual spatial information quickly, be able to hunt prey, close space quickly, right? Or understand, geography quickly and things like that, and process lots of visual spatial information, you wouldn't be able to survive without your right brain or with severe damage to your right brain, right? Because that would be impossible, or at least impossible to do effectively. And you might not need language as much. But in today's society, the one that we live in, language is so important, it makes it very difficult to function without it. Okay? All right. Lobes of the brain. Okay, we talked about the four lobes before. Frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Okay? And we mentioned this earlier, right? The occipital lobe receives information and processes visual information. The temporal lobe receives and processes auditory information. The parietal lobe receives and processes somatic information, touch information coming from the body. And the frontal lobe, which is the largest one, is involved in producing voluntary muscle movements, thinking, planning, and emotional control. Okay, now look, this overlaps with some of the stuff that we talked about before. And part of the reason for that is because the brain overlaps, right? The functioning of certain areas of the brain overlap. And there are multiple functions carried out by each area of the brain. So some of it is overlapping, some of it's a little bit redundant, etc. Okay, all right, almost done. Last one. Okay, now the limbic system. Okay, so within the forebrain is something called the limbic. There are a group of forebrain structures that border around sort of the limbic system area, right? There's the brainstem, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. Okay, they're all here in this image. Okay, so let's take a look at what each of them does quickly. The hippocampus is part of the limbic system. It's involved in learning and memory. Okay, it plays an important role in the ability to form new memories and events, and damage can result in total or permanent short-term memory loss, or the inability to learn or make new memories. Okay, the hypothalamus has neural pathways that are connected to other parts of the brain and within the brain. It can be involved in a lot of different behaviors. They say the 4 F's: fight, flight, and oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the last F. But the 4 F's, right? Hunger, thirst, sleep, water balance. It'll come back to me, the 4th F. I apologize. I think it's fear and fornication, I believe. But yeah, the 4 F's, they call it. The amygdala is related to emotion. Okay, it's involved in negative emotions, fear, disgust, aggression. And if you stimulate the amygdala, you can actually produce fear or apprehension. Okay, it's also involved in learning and forming new memories. And it's involved in the ability to identify emotion from people's facial expressions. Okay, one last concept in this very dense chapter is something called neuroplasticity. Okay, neuro meaning nerve or neuron, and plasticity meaning change. One thing to understand is that we have these biological structures in the brain, and it seems like it's a direct cause and effect. You have this structure that controls fear, and so it's going to cause fear when it's activated. But it's not that simple, right? The brain is a living organism that is responsive to stimuli, but the brain can change. It can change on a micro level with regard to the individual neurons, or it can change on a macro level where it comes to shape, size, structure, functioning, etc. And so stimulus from the environment can actually change the number of neurons allocated to an area. It can actually change the shape of the neurons. It can actually change the responsiveness of the neurons, etc. Okay, and this stimulus actually changes the brain. And as the brain changes, the way that the brain functions and responds to information will change over time, right? This is partly what happens in the learning process. It's partly what happens in the memory process. And the reason why this is important to understand is because nothing is actually set in stone. There's nothing that's completely hardwired that can't be totally overridden or at least altered a little bit. Okay, the depths and the length and the breadth of neuroplasticity is still not fully known and is still not fully understood. But it is important to understand that the brain can change, and the process or the concept of neuroplasticity is basically just that, understanding that the brain can alter and develop new connections based on experience, which means you can learn new things. You can change the way you think, right? And that can be from little things to big things, okay? All right, again, I know that this chapter was dense. There's a lot of information. I highly suggest that you go over it a couple of different times. You take your own notes on the slides and things like that. But hopefully you got through this. Hopefully you took something from this, and hopefully it was as clear as it could be. Okay, thanks.